Our gospel reading today, in keeping with the pattern from the last few weeks, is a long one. So if at any time you need to sit down, that is perfectly okay. The gospel today comes from the gospel according to John, the 11th chapter. Now a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, in the village of Mary and her sister Martha. Mary was the one who anointed the Lord with perfume and wiped his feet with her hair. Her brother Lazarus was ill. So the sister sent a message to Jesus, "Lord, he whom you love is ill." But when Jesus heard it, he said, "This illness does not lead to death. Rather, it is for God's glory, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it." Accordingly, though Jesus loved Martha and her sister Lazarus, after having heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. Then, after this, he said to the disciples, "Let us go to Judea again." The disciples said to him, "Rabbi, the Judeans were just now trying to stone you, and you are going there again?" Jesus answered, "Are there not 12 hours of daylight? Those who walk during the day do not stumble because they see the light of this world, but those who walk at night stumble because the light is not in them." After saying this, he told them, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I am going there to awaken him." The disciple said to him, "Lord, if he has fallen asleep, he will be all right." Jesus, however, had been speaking about his death, but they thought he was referring merely to sleep. Then Jesus told them plainly, "Lazarus is dead. For your sake, I am glad I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him." Thomas, who was called the twin, said to his fellow disciples, "Let us also go, that we may die with him." When Jesus arrived, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb 4 days. Now Bethany was near Jerusalem, some 2 miles away, and many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them about their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went and met him, while Mary stayed at home. Martha said to Jesus, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now, I know that God will give you whatever you ask him." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha said to him, "I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, even though they die, will live. And everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this?" She said to him, "Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, the one coming into the world." When she said this, she went back and called her sister Mary and told her privately, "The teacher is here and is calling for you." And when she heard it, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet come to the village, but was still in the place where Martha had met him. The Jewish leaders who were with her in the house consoling her saw Mary get up and quickly go out. They followed her because they thought that she was going to the tomb to weep there. When Mary came where Jesus was and saw him, she knelt at his feet and said to him, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the leaders who came with her also weeping, he was greatly disturbed in spirit and deeply moved. He said, "Where have you laid him?" They said to him, "Lord, come and see." Jesus began to weep. So the Jews said, "See how he loved him." And some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" Then Jesus, again greatly disturbed, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone was laying against it. Jesus said, "Take away the stone." Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him, "Lord, already there is a stench, because he has been dead 4 days." Jesus said to her, "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone. And Jesus looked upward and said, "Father, I thank you for having heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I have said this for the sake of the crowd standing here, so that they may believe that you sent me." When he had said this, he cried with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." The dead man came out, his hands and feet bound with strips of cloth, and his face wrapped in a cloth. Jesus said to them, "Unbind him and let him go." Many of the Jews, therefore, who had come with Mary and had seen what Jesus did, believed in him. This is the gospel of the Lord. Please be seated. Good morning, friends. Many of you know that I worked for a season at Harborview Medical Center as a chaplain, or a spiritual care provider, as they call them these days. I did a 6-month internship there when I was in seminary, and then stayed on their on-call list for a few years. And actually, for the first 6 months before I started here, I worked there just about full-time. If you don't know Harborview, it's the level 1 trauma center for a 5-state area. It serves Washington, Idaho, Montana, Alaska, and the northern part of Wyoming. It's also the hospital for the King County prison system. It is King County's primary Medicaid hospital, and it is the inpatient psych hospital for the state of Washington. Harborview is a place of life and death, with everything in between. It is one of those places where suffering is all around you, and it can be tempting to ask this question from the prophet Ezekiel: can these bones live? I have some wonderful stories from my time at Harborview. Some were gut-wrenching and tragic, some were beautiful and hopeful. But there was a sentiment that I heard a lot when I worked there, sometimes from patients, sometimes from their families. Maybe you've heard it or said it. It was something to the extent of, well, God must have had a reason for this to happen. God must have had a plan. This must be God's will. These words normally come from a good place. We're trying to make sense of something that doesn't make sense. We're trying to say that pain isn't meaningless. But if we're honest, these words don't always comfort. Sometimes they wound. Because if God has a reason for all this, if God planned this, then what kind of God are we talking about? And then we come to this story in the Gospel of John. And while this story is one of my favorites, it also frustrates me a lot. Because Jesus does something I don't want Jesus to do. Jesus hears that his friend Lazarus is sick, and he kind of says a version of this phrase. He says this illness does not lead to death, rather it is for God's glory. Which kind of sounds like God did this. God caused this. God needed this to happen. But I don't believe that's how God works. And yet I'm inclined to believe Jesus, so I want to get really particular about what he says. He says this illness is for God's glory. Well, if that's the case, then Jesus does 3 things in this story to reveal God's glory. And that's what I have for you today, a real simple 3-part sermon. First, I look at what Jesus does right when he learns Lazarus is sick. After he gives this speech about glory, he stays put. He doesn't rush to the bedside. He doesn't drop everything and sprint. He stays where he is. Which seems strange, doesn't it? Because we expect love to hurry. We expect urgency and anxiety, but Jesus isn't anxious. That's the first glimpse of God's glory in this story. Not control, not fixing everything, but a kind of deep, grounded presence that is not frantic in the face of fear. I remember one patient at Harborview who had severe burns on his legs. He was unhoused, and his tent had caught fire in the middle of the night. I had no idea what I was going to do to help him. But he was so excited to see me when I came in the room. He was like, Chaplain, I'm so glad you're here. I need a Bible. And I was like, great, I can get you a Bible. And then he was like, great, I need you to show me how to use it. And I was like, great, I'm in seminary. I love showing people how to use the Bible. And then he was like, great. Are there any stories in the Bible of people who have messed up their whole lives? And I was like, yes, most of them. I love this question. We can talk. And he was like, okay, I also need a copy of that poem, the one with the footprints in the sand. Do you know that poem? And I was like, of course I know that poem. I can get you the copy of that poem. And I had my hand on the doorknob. I was ready to go. And he was like, cool. Could you also get me like a book or a poem or something that I could send to my daughter so she knows I'm really sorry? And I was like, well, that's the real question, isn't it? That's the real pain. And unfortunately, no Bible verse or poem or prayer or book, no doctrine fixes that. This man was alone in a hospital room with third-degree burns on his legs and a mountain of guilt on his soul. And I was so quick to go get something for him, to do something to make it better. But he needed someone who would stay put. He just needed someone who would linger and listen. And that's what God does. God is not panicked by what panics us. God is not overwhelmed by what overwhelms us. God stays. That's the first part of God's glory. The second is a little more intense, because when Jesus finally arrives, Lazarus is dead. Mary is weeping, Martha is grieving. The whole community is wrapped in sorrow. And Jesus does something surprising. He weeps. This is the shortest verse in the Bible. Jesus wept. Jesus has said that this is for God's glory, so shouldn't Jesus be comforting people? Shouldn't he be at least acting nonchalant and telling them not to worry? But that's not what Jesus does. Instead, what we see is this: God does not stand above our suffering, explaining it to us. God stands within suffering, feeling it. God is heartbroken. The glory of God is not that God causes pain or even that God fixes it. It's that God refuses to be untouched by our suffering. God weeps. I remember another case at Harborview, one of the worst that I saw. I was called to sit in the waiting room with a woman who the doctors were still trying to resuscitate her husband. She didn't really understand what was going on or what was happening, but she pulled a letter out of her purse and said that she found it on his desk. She handed it to me, and I read it. And it's a mystery to me why the same situation can cause some to turn to hope and others to hopelessness. Sometimes it's shame, sometimes it's grief, sometimes it's just simple burnout. Many of the mystic traditions refer to hopelessness as the terminal condition of the soul. And hopelessness is what I read in that man's letter. And the wife asked me to pray, and I took her hands, and I said, "I am so sorry." And we held hands and cried together. And nothing I could have said would have been a better prayer, because I know that God was weeping too, because Jesus stays and Jesus weeps. There's one more moment in the Lazarus story that kind of gets overlooked, but I think it also reveals God's glory. As Jesus approaches the tomb, the text says that he becomes greatly disturbed. Jesus is not calm in the face of death. He's not serene. He's not saying, "Well, that's just the way things are." I think if I were Jesus, I would have been a little snarky, like, "Come on, guys, watch this." But as we've established, Jesus is present. And in being present, Jesus is disturbed. Because death is disturbing. Pain is wrong. This is not how things are supposed to be. Just a few verses ago in the Gospel of John, before the reading we heard today, Jesus told the crowds that he came that we may have life and life abundantly. Trauma and suffering and death are just wrong. Abundant life is God's will, and that's God's dream for all of us. In other words, God is not okay with the things that hurt us. God does not accept suffering as part of some neat and tidy plan. God resists it. The glory of God is not passive acceptance. It's love that refuses to make peace with anything that destroys life. During that internship at Harborview, we had to write up reports on the patients that we saw and share them with a cohort of peers who would give us feedback. And one of my colleagues shared a story about working with the father of a young toddler who had been injured. And the father had actually saved the kid, but not before the injuries had been really bad. And my colleague kept saying things to him like, "Well, you're such a good dad." And he looked at her and said, "What does that matter? You just don't get it." And this actually led to our cohort motto, you can't drag people into hope. Because pain is disturbing, and hope is a weak antidote. Jesus doesn't do everything is going to turn out fine speeches. Jesus crawls into the tomb, and Jesus gets disturbed. This is the whole promise of the incarnation, that God came to dwell among us, and God gets greatly disturbed by the pain and the suffering and the death of this world. So if this story of illness is for God's glory, then God's glory looks like this. It's an unanxious presence. It's heartbreaking compassion. It's holy resistance. It's not triumph. It's not control. It's not everything happens for a reason. And this is where our theology gets turned upside down, because we tend to look for glory in power, in fixing things, and in making everything come out right. But the theology of the cross is that God is revealed somewhere else entirely. God is revealed in the staying, in the weeping, and in the suffering that disturbs us. If you want to see God's glory, don't just look for empty tombs. Look for tears. You know, at Harborview, we used to say that the medical system is obsessed with the big D death, the final end of life, the last breath, those kinds of things. But people suffer lots of little d deaths in their lives too. And sometimes those hurt even more. I mean, there are death-dealing forces of guilt that conspire to steal our self-worth. There are death-dealing forces of shame that tell us that we are wrong. There are death-dealing forces of hopelessness that tell us nothing will ever be good again. There are death-dealing forces that isolate us and silence us and make us doubt that we are loved or forget that we were made for life. You know, I look no further than our youth for an example of this. When Pastor Julie and I asked our middle schoolers and high schoolers what they wanted to learn about from their pastors, the number one response was, "What can we do about bullying?" Bullying is certainly a death-dealing force. It piles on shame and hurt and hopelessness. Can you think of others? These little deaths, they pile up. They feel permanent, and they feel like they win. And in the midst of pain, we might ask that question from Ezekiel: can these bones live? Have you ever felt that? Has your life ever been so shattered that you asked, can these bones live? Well, here's the good news. The God who stays, the God who weeps, and the God who is disturbed by death, this God is also with us in the little deaths too. In the moments where our bones feel dry, that God is present where shame tries to stop us, where fear tries to silence us, and where grief threatens to overwhelm us. God's glory is revealed in God's refusal to abandon us to any force of death, big or small. And yes, Jesus also raises Lazarus. And when he does, Jesus gives two instructions, two things that might help us see resurrection in our own dry bones. First, what Jesus says to Lazarus: come out. Jesus says the same to you. Whatever force of death has knocked you down, Jesus stands at the tomb, and the loving voice of God is calling you to come out. Guilt does not get the last word. Shame does not tell you who you are. Pain is not the end of your story. But notice, Lazarus doesn't come out all shiny and spotless and free. He comes out wrapped in tattered cloths, still bound, still smelling like death. Which is when Jesus says the second thing. He turns to the community and says, unbind him. And that is what we are called to do for each other. We who have received God's mercy in our own suffering must unbind the forces of death in one another. We must unbind the forces of fear and guilt and shame and hopelessness. We must unbind the lies and the hurts that bullies place on us. We have to unbind the systems of homophobia and racism and discrimination wherever we encounter them. And what does it look like? It looks like staying, and it looks like weeping, and it looks like being disturbed. You know, this story is the moment in the Gospel of John that sets everything else in motion. This is the story that gets Jesus killed. From this point on, the authorities decide Jesus has to go. Because resurrection is safe when it's hypothetical, when it's someday far off in the future. But when resurrection shows up here and now, in the middle of our grief and our loss and our suffering, well, that is dangerous. Because it means that God is already at work, right here, right now. And if God can enter into suffering, then what power does anything have? If God can unbind, or if we can unbind one another, then how can anyone ever be controlled again? God does not cause suffering, but God refuses to have suffering have the last word. That is the glory of God. Amen.